He said it so easily, like swatting a fly. Honestly, Mom, you're just bad luck. The words landed not like stones thrown in anger, which I understood, but like droplets of acid, small and insidious, burning deep and spreading slow. He was standing by the door, already halfway out, his face set in that familiar, slightly impatient mask he wore when he wanted something or was annoyed he hadn't gotten it yet. My daughter-in-law, Sarah, hovered behind him, a practiced expression of sympathy tinged with exasperation on her face, a look she perfected over the years as she watched him chip away at my reserves, both emotional and financial. It had been about the car, this time. Not a new car, mind you, but a loan for a different used car because the one I'd helped him with last year had apparently developed an unforeseen major issue, just 6 months after I'd paid for the repairs on the one before that. They always had a reason, a perfectly reasonable, slightly dramatic explanation for why they needed just a little more, why things just never quite worked out for them, and why somehow it was always my fault, or fate's fault, but never theirs. My old house, the house I'd lived in for 40 years, the one with the creaky stairs and the garden that refused to give up its weeds, felt suddenly cold. The afternoon sun, usually a comfort as it slanted through the living room window, seemed harsh, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, tiny, insignificant things, much like I suddenly felt. He just listed off a string of minor misfortunes, the leaky faucet he couldn't afford to fix, the parking ticket he insisted wasn't his fault, the job promotion that went to someone else, clearly less qualified, in his opinion, and somehow, the thread connecting all these unrelated events led back to me. My presence, my influence, my very existence, was, in his estimation, a jinx. Bad luck. For years, decades really, I had smoothed his path. Sacrificed trips, delayed renovations, dipped into savings meant for my own later years. All to help him, to give him the leg up I thought he deserved, the one his father hadn't been around to provide consistently after the divorce. He was my only child, my son, and somewhere deep down, in the place where maternal love overrides all logic, I believed that my help was an investment in his future, in our connection, in a shared history that meant something. I wanted him to be happy, successful, secure. I wanted him to know he was loved, unconditionally. But somewhere along the line, my unconditional love had morphed into his unconditional expectation. And my support, my sacrifices, had become not gifts freely given, but entitlements long overdue. Sarah had been instrumental in this shift. Not overtly, not at first. She was too clever for that. It was subtle suggestions, quiet sighs, stories of their struggles told with just the right amount of innocent helplessness. "Oh, bless your heart, you shouldn't worry your pretty head about our troubles," she'd say to me, while subtly outlining troubles that conveniently required a specific, usually significant, amount of money to solve. She was like kudzu, wrapping herself around him, around our relationship, slowly but surely choking the life out of it, all while presenting a perfectly lovely, smiling facade. She was always so appreciative, so charming, right up until the moment the money or the help wasn't immediately forthcoming or wasn't exactly what they wanted. Then the mask would slip, just for a second, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. He had always been quick to deflect blame, even as a child. The spilled milk wasn't his fault, the broken toy was already faulty, the poor grade was the teacher's bias. I'd seen it, of course, but I'd excused it, framed it as youthful innocence, a sensitive nature, a boy who needed gentle guidance, not harsh criticism. I see now that I wasn't guiding, I was enabling. I was cultivating the very entitlement that now stood before me, labeling me a blight on his otherwise perfect potential life. Bad luck. The weight of those 2 words felt heavier than any physical burden I'd ever carried. It wasn't just an insult, it was a negation. It dismissed every sacrifice, every worry, every sleepless night I'd spent thinking about him, praying for him, working for him. It reduced me to a negative force, a cosmic inconvenience. And the way he said it, with that weary, almost pitying tone, as if it were a simple, unfortunate fact of nature, like rain on a parade or a stubborn cold. He wasn't angry. He was stating what he genuinely seemed to believe. That I was the reason his life wasn't everything he felt it should be.
Me.
The woman who had given him everything. A strange quiet settled over me after they left. The house felt even bigger, the silence deeper. I walked through the rooms, my hand trailing along the familiar worn surfaces of furniture I'd owned longer than he'd been alive. The armchair where I'd rocked him as a baby, the dining table where we'd celebrated birthdays and holidays, the kitchen counter where he'd done his homework, complaining about fractions. Each object held a memory, a thread in the tapestry of a life I thought we shared, a foundation I believed was solid. But his words had acted like a tremor, revealing cracks I hadn't wanted to see, fissures that had been widening for years beneath the surface of forced pleasantries and transactional affections. He had said it, and Sarah had nodded, a silent, subtle agreement passing between them. They truly believed it. I wasn't just his mother. I was an obstacle, a jinx, a source of negative energy holding back his glorious destiny. And in that moment, as the door clicked shut and their footsteps faded down the path, something inside me shifted. A switch flipped. The hurt was profound, a physical ache in my chest, but beneath it, a cold, clear anger began to solidify. Not the hot, messy anger of indignation or wounded pride, but a still, deep-seated resolve. Bad luck, he said.
Fine.
If that's what I am in his eyes, then maybe it was time I stopped being his good fortune. Maybe it was time the bad luck started working in a different direction. I walked over to my small writing desk, pulled out a fresh sheet of paper, and picked up my pen. It was late, but I didn't care. The house was silent now, truly silent. And in that silence, a decision was made. It was time to make some changes. Significant changes. Starting with the will. The decision itself felt surprisingly uncomplicated once the shock wore off. It wasn't fueled by revenge. Not exactly, though a part of me felt a fierce, protective instinct rise up for the woman I had been, the one he had so easily dismissed. It was about reclaiming agency. It was about recognizing that the future I had painstakingly planned, the one where my assets would provide a cushion for my son and his family, was based on a fantasy, a picture of family that existed only in my head. The reality was this transaction, this perpetual need, this ultimate dismissal of my worth beyond what I could provide. His words had broken something fundamental, a core belief I held about our bond. And in breaking it, they had also set me free. I sat at the desk for a long time, the blank paper mocking me slightly. It wasn't about filling it with legal jargon. That would come later. It was about the intention. The shift in perspective. For years, my will had been simple. Everything to my son, eventually. With provisions for Sarah, of course, and later, anticipated grandchildren who had never materialized. It was the default, the expected path. It represented the culmination of a lifetime of work, saving, managing, all with the unspoken understanding that it was for him, for his future. Now that path was obliterated, paved over by two careless, cruel words. The hurt was still there, a dull throb, but the anger had sharpened into focus. How many times had I bent over backward? How many times had I made excuses for him, convinced myself he didn't mean that careless remark, didn't intend that slight, didn't realize how his constant requests for money or help drained me, not just financially, but emotionally. I remember the time he'd called, frantic, saying they were going to lose their apartment if they didn't have 3 months' rent by the end of the week. I'd scraped together everything I could, even borrowed a small amount from my modest retirement fund, staying up late filling out forms, making transfers. When I gave him the money, his relief lasted about 5 minutes before he started talking about needing new tires. There was never a moment of genuine gratitude, not for long, anyway. It was always just a stepping stone to the next need, the next demand. And Sarah, she was the quiet architect of his entitlement. She never asked directly, not usually. She would talk about their dreams, their struggles, their hopes for the future, always emphasizing how difficult it was to achieve them without a certain amount of capital, always hinting at how easy things would be if only. She had a way of making you feel guilty for having anything they didn't, even if you had worked your entire life for it. She'd comment on my lovely home, sighing about their cramped apartment. She'd admire a piece of my modest jewelry, lamenting that she could never afford anything so nice. It wasn't overt pressure. It was atmospheric manipulation, creating a climate of expectation and subtle resentment if those expectations weren't met. Their visit today hadn't even been about the car, initially. It was supposed to be a quick coffee. But within 10 minutes, the conversation had predictably turned to their financial woes, the universe's apparent conspiracy against their prosperity, and the specific sum of money needed to overcome the current hurdle, this time, the car. And when I hesitated, gently explaining that my own unexpected medical bills had depleted my readily available funds, that's when he'd said it. Honestly, Mom, you're just bad luck. As if my very existence was an unfortunate cosmic event negatively impacting his finances. The quiet resolve deepened. This wasn't a hasty decision born of fleeting anger. This was the culmination of years of subtle erosion, of feeling increasingly taken for granted, undervalued, seen less as a person and more as a resource. His words were the final, undeniable confirmation that the relationship I thought I had with my son was an illusion. It was a transaction, and in his eyes, I was a faulty product. I picked up the phone, my hand steady. It was late, but I knew his number by heart. Michael, my lawyer, a kind, decent man who had handled my affairs since my divorce. He was used to my calls, usually about boring things like property taxes or insurance. This call would be different. I checked the time. Almost 9. Too late for a social call, but not too late for an urgent one, if framed correctly. I took a deep breath and dialed. It rang several times before his answering machine picked up. I left a brief, calm message. Michael, it's Martha. I need to make some significant changes to my will. As soon as possible. Please call me first thing in the morning. My voice didn't tremble. It sounded steady, deliberate, disconnected, even, from the storm of emotions still churning within me. The simple act of leaving that message felt powerful. It was the first concrete step, a declaration of intent not just to Michael, but to myself. The game had changed. I spent the rest of the night not sleeping, but walking through the house again, touching things, remembering. But this time, the memories felt different. Less tinged with wistful affection, more with a critical eye. I saw the worn patch on the carpet where the Christmas tree always stood, remembering the forced cheer of recent holidays, the thinly veiled impatience of my son and daughter-in-law, their quick departures. I looked at the framed photos on the mantelpiece, a younger me, beaming, holding a baby version of my son, his graduation photo, his wedding photo, Sarah's radiant smile beside his slightly stiff one. They felt like relics of a different era, a different reality. They represented hopes and dreams that had not only failed to materialize, but had curdled into something resentful and cold. I thought about my life's work, my savings. It wasn't vast wealth, but it was comfortable. Enough to see me through, with careful management, and leave something behind. Something I had earned, penny by penny, sacrifice by sacrifice. It represented my security, my independence. And I had been preparing to give it away to the very people who saw me as bad luck. The irony was a bitter taste in my mouth. He called me bad luck, as if my entire being was a negative influence, as if my love, my support, my very existence was a burden. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about dignity. It was about realizing that I had allowed myself to be defined by their needs, their expectations, their shallow metrics of success and fortune. I had poured myself into a vessel that would never be filled, only demand more. And he had the audacity, the sheer, stunning lack of awareness, to label me the problem. The sun eventually began to lighten the sky, painting the garden in hesitant hues of gray and pink. I hadn't slept, but I didn't feel tired. I felt alert, awakened, like someone who had been sleepwalking for years and had finally been jolted awake, painfully but completely. The house, which had felt cold and lonely just hours before, now felt like a sanctuary. My sanctuary. It was filled with my things, my memories, the echoes of my life, not just the parts one had shared with him. The decision solidified with the dawn. This wasn't just changing a document. It was redrawing the boundaries of my life. It was declaring that my worth was not contingent on his approval, my purpose not solely defined by his needs. Bad luck. Perhaps. But from now on, my luck, good or bad, would be my own. The next morning, Michael called promptly at 9. His voice was his usual calm, measured tone. "Martha? You left a message about your will?" "Yes, Michael," I said, my voice steady. "I need to come in. As soon as possible. There are significant changes I need to make." He paused, a brief silence on the line. "Significant changes? To the primary beneficiary, you mean?" He handled a lot of elder law. He knew the usual triggers. "Yes, Michael. To everything. The entire structure needs to be reviewed."
And changed.
Another pause, slightly longer this time. "All right, Martha. Are you all right?" This sounds sudden. "I'm perfectly all right, Michael. In fact, I feel clearer than I have in years. It's not sudden, really. It's been a long time coming. Something just crystallized yesterday." I didn't elaborate. I didn't need to. The reasons were mine, the pain was mine, and the decision was mine. "Very well. I'll look at my schedule. Can you come in this afternoon? Say 2 o'clock? 2 o'clock would be perfect, Michael. Thank you." Hanging up the phone, I felt a lightness I hadn't expected. The house still held echoes of the past, but they no longer felt like chains. They felt like history. My history. I spent the morning gathering the relevant documents, the existing will, lists of assets, property deeds. As I handled them, objects that once represented future provisions for my son now felt like tools for my own liberation. This wasn't dismantling, it was rebuilding. Rebuilding my own life on a foundation of self-worth, not obligation or expectation. The drive to Michael's office was usually a mundane affair. Today, it felt momentous. The familiar streets seemed sharper, the colors brighter. I noticed the small details, the way the light hit the leaves on the trees, the sound of children laughing in a park. These were the things I had often overlooked, my focus narrowed by the constant background hum of worry about my son, about their struggles, about whether I was doing enough. Now, with that burden lifted, I could see the world again. Michael's office was quiet and understated, filled with leather-bound books and the scent of old paper. He greeted me warmly, his expression kind but also discerning. He had seen a lot over the years, witnessed the complex, often fraught relationships between parents and adult children. He knew how wills could be instruments of love, or regret, or even quiet retaliation. I sat across from him, the stack of papers on the desk between us. He waited, not rushing me. "So, Martha," he began gently, "you said significant changes." I looked at him, meeting his gaze directly. "Yes, Michael. Everything is changing. My son, he will no longer be the primary beneficiary of my estate." He didn't flinch. His expression remained calm, professional, but his eyes held a flicker of understanding, perhaps even sympathy.
"All right."
"If you're sure about that, it's a big decision." "I am absolutely sure. It's not a decision I made lightly, though the catalyst was sudden. But it's been building. Years of things." I didn't need to lay out the whole painful history. He could read between the lines. He told me I was bad luck. Michael's eyebrows rose slightly. That seemed to confirm for him the depth of the fracture. "Bad luck," he repeated softly, as if testing the words himself.
"Yes."
"Apparently, my existence is a negative influence on his potential prosperity." He said it yesterday, right here in my living room, with Sarah standing right there, nodding along. The words were simple, factual, devoid of the raw emotion I'd felt the night before. It was as if stating them aloud gave them a different kind of power, a cold, undeniable reality. "I see," Michael said, his voice still quiet. "And that was the catalyst. It was the final straw, Michael. The absolute last one. It made me realize that everything I've been doing, everything I've been planning, is based on a relationship that simply doesn't exist. Not in the way I thought it did. He doesn't see me as his mother, someone to cherish or care for. He sees me as a resource. A lottery ticket he's just waiting to cash in. And apparently, even as a resource, I'm defective. A short, humorless laugh escaped me. Bad luck. We spent the next 2 hours going through my assets, discussing alternatives. It was surprisingly empowering. Instead of thinking about how much I could leave behind, we talked about what I might need in the coming years. Long-term care insurance, potential home modifications, funds for travel I'd always dreamed of but put off. It felt selfish, wonderfully, rightfully selfish, to finally prioritize my own security and well-being. And then we discussed who would inherit. I didn't have other children. No close siblings. A few distant cousins I hadn't seen in years. What about charities, Martha? Michael suggested. Or perhaps someone else you know. Someone who has shown you kindness? Or someone who genuinely needs help and appreciates it. The thought sparked something. Kindness. Appreciation. Qualities that had been conspicuously absent in my interactions with my son and his wife. I thought of my neighbor, Mrs. Gable, a widow herself, who always brought me soup when I was sick and helped me with my groceries even when she was struggling with her own mobility issues. I thought of the local animal shelter where I volunteered sometimes, seeing the tireless, often heartbreaking work the staff and volunteers did with so little funding. I thought of the community college that offered scholarships to students who were the first in their families to attend higher education, students who had to fight for every opportunity. A quiet smile formed on my lips. There were so many places, so many people who could use the help, who would genuinely appreciate it, who wouldn't see it as an entitlement or, worse, tainted by bad luck. We started drafting the new will, clause by clause. Setting aside funds for my own care, creating bequests for specific charities, even a small sum for Mrs. Gable, earmarked for her kindness. It wasn't about punishing my son. It was about redirecting resources to where they would be valued, where they would do good, where the recipients wouldn't label the giver as a jinx. It was about honoring my own life, my own values, with the legacy I built. Leaving Michael's office, I carried a different kind of weight, not the oppressive burden of expectation and hurt, but the quiet strength of having taken control. The will wasn't signed yet. That would happen next week, after Michael had the draft prepared and I had time to review it. But the decision was made, the wheels set in motion, and knowing that felt like shedding a heavy cloak I'd worn for years. The following days were strange. My son called, of course, probably wondering why I hadn't immediately capitulated about the car. I was polite, brief. I said I was feeling a bit under the weather and would talk later. I didn't mention the will, didn't mention our last conversation. I simply existed, privately enacting the biggest change in my life while maintaining a facade of normalcy. The irony wasn't lost on me. They were still operating under the assumption that I was their safety net, their eventual windfall. They were oblivious to the earthquake their casual cruelty had triggered. I started doing things differently. Small things at first. I bought myself a new dress, something brighter than my usual practical choices. I booked a weekend trip to the coast, something I'd always wanted to do, but had never felt I could justify the expense when my son might need help. I increased my volunteer hours at the animal shelter. Each small act felt like a quiet act of rebellion, a reclaiming of time and resources that I had mentally allocated elsewhere for so long. My conversations with my son and Sarah became shorter, more stilted. They seemed to sense a shift, a subtle withdrawal on my part, but they couldn't identify it. They attributed my distance to me being tired or not feeling well, their usual dismissals of my state of being when it didn't align with their expectations. They continued to talk about their plans, their future, their needs, the subtext of eventual inheritance always present, a ghost at the feast I no longer intended to host for them. Sarah invited me for lunch. It was her attempt to gauge what was happening. She was overly sweet, overly concerned. "Mom, are you sure you're okay? You seem a little distant." I smiled pleasantly. "I'm fine, Sarah. Just busy. Lots going on." "Oh, anything exciting?" she asked, her eyes sharp with curiosity. She was fishing for information, for any hint of a change in my routine, my finances, anything that might affect their expected trajectory. "Just managing things," I said vaguely. "Getting my affairs in order." The phrase hung in the air, innocent enough, yet loaded with a meaning she couldn't grasp. She pressed gently. Managing things. Like the house? Are you thinking of selling? You know, we've always said if you ever needed help, we'd be right there. The help always implied them moving in, taking over, positioning themselves for the eventual inheritance. I met her gaze. The house is fine, Sarah. It's where I belong. I let a beat pass. Getting my affairs in order for the future. Making sure everything is allocated properly. Her smile wavered slightly. Allocated?
Oh,
Yes, of course. Well, it's good to be prepared, isn't it? The shift in her tone was almost imperceptible, a subtle hardening around the eyes. She knew I meant my will, my estate. The word allocated felt different from the assumed destination she had taken for granted. It is, I agreed, taking a sip of my tea. Very prepared. The rest of the lunch was a careful dance around the edges of the unspoken. She tried to bring up their financial stresses again, hinting at the perennial car trouble. I listened politely but offered no solutions, no sympathy beyond a general, "Oh dear, that sounds difficult." The well of my automatic generosity had run dry the moment my son called me bad luck. The day came to sign the new will. Michael was there, his assistant as the second witness. I read through the document one last time, every clause, every name. The list of charities, the provision for Mrs. Gable, the careful planning for my own potential future needs. My son's name was mentioned only in a brief, formal clause acknowledging him, but leaving him nothing substantial. No house, no significant funds, no family heirlooms of value, those I had decided to donate or give away while I was still alive. It felt stark, final, and profoundly right. As I signed my name on the dotted lines, a sense of calm settled over me. This wasn't an act of vengeance. It was an act of self-preservation and redirection. It was acknowledging that the person I had intended to leave my legacy to saw me only as a means to an end, and a flawed one at that. My legacy, the culmination of my life's work and values, deserved a better destination. It deserved to go to those who would value it, or need it genuinely, or use it for good, not just consume it as an expected due. The signed will was filed and secured. The physical act was done. But the true change was internal. I walked out of Michael's office feeling lighter, freer. The weight of expectation, the invisible chains of obligation, had been broken. I was no longer the bank of mom, perpetually open for withdrawals, constantly evaluated for my financial health and perceived luck. I was just Martha, a woman with her own life, her own resources, her own future to plan and enjoy. The tension with my son and daughter-in-law grew subtly, but steadily over the next few months. They could feel the shift, the closing off of the wellspring they had depended on. Their calls became less frequent, their visits shorter. The charming facade Sarah wore thinned, revealing impatience and frustration more often. My son's voice held an edge of thinly veiled resentment when he did call. He couldn't articulate what was different, but he knew something fundamental had changed. Their requests for money became less common, replaced by pointed questions about my health, my plans, my assets. They were trying to regain control, to understand the new landscape, to find the path back to the expected inheritance. I maintained my calm, pleasant distance. I was busy living my life. I took that trip to the coast, breathing in the salty air, walking on the beach, feeling utterly free. I volunteered more, finding genuine satisfaction in helping the animals, connecting with other volunteers who shared a common passion. I started a small garden club with Mrs. Gable and a few other neighbors, sharing plants and tips, building real community. One evening, my son called, his voice strained. "Mom, we need to talk." "Seriously? What's going on?" "You're acting different." "Different?" I asked, keeping my tone even. "How am I acting different?" "I'm living my life, dear. You know what I mean. You're not. You're not helping us anymore. You're off doing trips and garden clubs. We're still struggling." His entitlement was raw, exposed. "Yes," I said quietly. "I am living my life. And I'm managing my resources for my own future. But what about our future?" The indignation in his voice was palpable. Sarah must have been listening on speakerphone. I took a slow breath. This was it. The moment the truth, or at least a part of it, would have to surface. Your future, dear, is up to you to build. Just as my future was up to me to build. But the house. Everything. He spluttered, the mask of polite request fully gone, replaced by panicked demand. That's supposed to come to us. I felt no anger, only a profound sadness for the relationship that had never truly been, and a quiet strength in the face of his blatant expectation.
No, dear.
It's not supposed to come to anyone. It's mine. And I have made decisions about what will happen to it and to my other assets, based on my own priorities and values. What does that mean? Sarah's voice cut in, sharp and demanding. What have you done? It means, I said, choosing my words carefully, calmly, that I have updated my will. My estate will be distributed according to my wishes. Wishes that reflect who has valued me, who has shown kindness, and what causes are important to me. Silence stretched on the line, thick and heavy. They understood. Not the details, perhaps, but the core truth. The expected inheritance, the foundation of their perceived security and future plans, was gone. Then the storm broke. Anger, accusations, disbelief. You can't do this, my son yelled. We're your family, your son, after everything. Everything. I repeated softly. What exactly is everything you've done for me, dear? Besides ask for things and blame me when things didn't go your way? Including calling me bad luck? I let the words hang in the air. A callback to the moment that changed everything. That was different, he stammered, trying to backtrack, to regain some footing in the crumbling landscape of his expectations.
No, dear.
It wasn't different. It was the truth, as you saw it. And it showed me the truth, as I needed to see it. My voice was steady, unbreakable. My will reflects my life, my values, and the relationships that truly matter. You made it clear where I stood. You're being cruel, Sarah cried out, the sugary facade dissolving completely into bitter resentment. You're punishing us. I'm not punishing anyone, I said. I'm simply living my life and managing my affairs according to my own will, not someone else's expectations. I wish you both well. I hope you find the success and good fortune you seek. But you will need to find it on your own. I didn't wait for their response. I gently, deliberately, hung up the phone. The silence that followed was different from the silence after they left that night. This silence was not filled with pain or shock or the cold clarity of dawning realization. It was filled with peace. A deep, abiding peace. It was the silence of a battle won, not through conflict, but through withdrawal and quiet strength. The fallout was inevitable. They tried various tactics. Furious text messages, unanswered calls, attempts to enlist other distant relatives, who mostly stayed out of it, sensing the deep fracture. My son even showed up at my door once, alternating between anger and a pathetic attempt at pleading, talking about how hard their life was, how much they needed my help. I didn't let him in. I spoke to him through the closed screen door, calmly repeating that my decision was made, that my will was changed, and that his behavior had led to this outcome. He eventually left, slamming his hand against the door frame in frustration, a petulant child denied a toy. I never wavered. The pain of the estrangement was real, a dull ache that would likely never fully disappear. He was my son, after all, the baby I had held in my arms, the little boy who had chased fireflies in the backyard. The loss of that imagined future, the one where we were a close, loving family, was a sorrow I carried. But it was a manageable sorrow, not the suffocating weight of living a lie, of being perpetually undervalued and used. My focus shifted entirely to my own life, and to the lives my changed will would eventually touch. I spent more time volunteering, seeing firsthand the impact of even small acts of generosity. I deepened my friendships, sharing stories and laughter, building a support system based on mutual care and respect, not obligation or expectation. I took another trip, this time with Mrs. Gable, fulfilling her lifelong wish to see the mountains. Witnessing her joy was more fulfilling than any amount of forced gratitude for my son could ever have been. The house, the symbolic heart of the expected inheritance, became even more my sanctuary. I planted flowers that bloomed vibrant colors I had previously thought too frivolous. I rearranged furniture, creating spaces that were purely for my comfort and pleasure. It was no longer a potential asset to be passed on, but simply, beautifully, my home. I thought often about that night, the night my son called me bad luck. It was a dark moment, a painful turning point. But in retrospect, it was also a gift. A harsh, unwelcome gift, but a gift nonetheless. It stripped away the illusions, forcing me to see the truth of my situation and the nature of certain relationships. It freed me from a future I had designed based on someone else's expectations, a future that would have continued to drain me, leaving me feeling resentful and empty. Now, my future was my own. My resources were my own. My worth was not measured by my usefulness to others, but by my own sense of self, my ability to find joy, connection, and purpose on my own terms. The path ahead wasn't the one I had envisioned for decades, but it was real, it was mine, and it was filled with a quiet, hard-won empowerment. I still lived in the house, with the creaky stairs and the stubborn weeds. The photos on the mantelpiece were still there, artifacts of a different time. But the air in the house felt lighter. The silence was no longer empty, but peaceful, filled with the quiet hum of a life lived fully, independently. My son had called me bad luck. He couldn't have been more wrong. He hadn't cursed me. He had liberated me. And in that liberation, I found a strength I never knew I had, and a future that, while different, was finally, truly my own.
The will was changed.
And so was I.